Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to today's IE Cleantech Corner webinar. Thank you for taking time to being with us today for this special program. And thank you to our guests from the Recycling Partnership for joining us as well. The IE Cleantech Corner webinar series is part of UNC Institute for the Environment, and we extend our thanks to them as well. For today's webinar, we are thrilled to welcome guest speakers from the Recycling Partnership, who will be discussing the current state of US recycling system, as well as their recent policy report, Accelerating Recycling, Policy to Unlock Supply for the Circular Economy, which outlines public-private partnership solutions for leveling up the US recycling system and accelerating a circular economy. But before we start, we have a few housekeeping items, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. It is the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for today's program, we invite you to, as you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, because our speakers have graciously welcomed questions during their presentation, and they will try to weave them in as they go. And for any questions that they do not get to, they will handle at the end during the official Q&A portion of our program. So now on to the introductions. Please welcome Elizabeth Biser and Lily Schwarz from the Recycling Partnership, which is a national nonprofit organization that works with communities, companies, and policymakers to advance a circular economy. First up is Elizabeth Biser, who leads policy advocacy efforts for the Recycling Partnership's Circular Economy Accelerator. She works with diverse stakeholders to shape policy proposals that will advance a circular economy. She has testified before federal lawmakers on the challenges and opportunities facing community recycling programs. And Elizabeth brings nearly 15 years of experience representing environmental and natural resource interests before the North Carolina state legislature. She's a keen facilitator and excels in her ability to bring multiple stakeholders to the table and build consensus, a huge skill. A double Tar Heel, Elizabeth attended UNC Chapel Hill for her undergraduate degree and to receive her Master of Public Administration. So we are thrilled to have Elizabeth with us today. Her colleague Lily Schwarz also joins us today, and she serves as the Federal Affairs Manager for the Recycling Partnership, working with a wide range of stakeholders to devise and advance policy solutions that will solve the challenges of the US residential recycling system at scale. With experience that spans from researching and analyzing recycling policies across the nation to volunteering with Orange County, North Carolina's community recycling program, Lily brings a unique background and perspective to her work. She received her bachelor's degree in public policy and environmental studies from UNC Chapel Hill and remains an avid fan of the Tar Heels. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth and Lily. Take it away, Lily.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Lily Schwarz, and I remember as a student, I was so excited to attend the UNC Cleantech Summit. I always left feeling really energized and having learned about so many important topics. So to get to be on the other side is really exciting. And we want this presentation to be as informative as possible. So like it was mentioned, please enter your questions into the Q&A at any time. And if we don't cover them during the presentation, we will get to them at the end. So to start off, I'd love to just give some background on our organization, the Recycling Partnership. And if you'll advance to the next slide, please. The Recycling Partnership is a national 501c3 nonprofit that works with companies and communities across the nation to strengthen public recycling programs. Our organization brings together stakeholders from across a multitude of sectors, issues, and cultures, and we work at the intersection of public and private goals. We often say that partnership is part of our name for a reason, and that reason is that we know we can accomplish more together than any one stakeholder can do on their own. So if you'll advance to the next slide, please, you'll see that we've got a lot of different stakeholders sitting around our table. Our list of funding partners spans across many different facets of the recycling supply chain, to include material trade associations and companies that produce different packaging types, to household brands and companies that make products that come in that packaging, to the retailers who sell those products on their shelves, and even some of the haulers and waste processors who play a critical role in the collection and reprocessing stages of recycling. Through grant funding and technical assistance, the Recycling Partnership puts private dollars to work in communities across the country. We invest the money that we raise into recycling programs and system solutions that deliver on our mission to create more opportunities for Americans to recycle and ultimately to advance the US towards a more circular economy. And that's really why our organization exists. So next slide, please. After decades of increasing wastefulness, society is arguably at its peak reckoning of the economic and environmental consequences of our currently linear economy, one where we take, make, and waste our natural resources. In recent years, we've seen volatile shifts in the global market for some recyclable commodities, and as a result, communities are faced with higher costs to process their recyclables. These higher costs lead to scenarios where communities have to make tough decisions regarding the operation and the continuation of their recycling programs. In addition to those global market challenges, the speed of packaging innovation has far outpaced the capabilities of our modern recycling infrastructure. This adds complexity and further stress to the recycling system as a whole. And as we've all seen in the news, a marine debris crisis is impacting our oceans and threatening our greater ecosystems. So with all of these factors combined, this has prompted leaders from both the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to act together to tackle these issues and to accelerate a circular economy. One where we design out waste and pollution to keep products and materials in use. And to accomplish this, we know that we need smart policy solutions. So Elizabeth, I'll hand it over to you to talk about the Recycling Partnership's decision to launch the Circular Economy Accelerator.
Great, well, thank you, and thanks for having us today. It's great to be talking with a UNC group. So if we go to the next slide, we started a policy arm a couple of years ago called the Circular Economy Accelerator, because, as Lily pointed out, with all of the reasons that we desperately needed to upgrade our system, and we were working community by community, which is very important, we weren't seeing gains fast enough. And so policy is a lever to accelerate that rate of change, both from our perspective as a nonprofit of looking at how can we level up that recycling system and also drive towards a more circular economy. But also a lot of our partners around the table have made ambitious sustainability goals, and they can't get their hands on enough material to make good on some of those goals. And so there's a lot of urgency around the table, both with our partners and internally, to explore options to go further faster. And so that's what led us to establishing the Circular Economy Accelerator. And you'll see here three items that really drove our purpose as we formed. And so one of those is incentivizing recycling over disposal. We hear from mayors and local government leaders throughout the country that it's a real challenge for them when recycling can be sometimes twice as much as it costs them to landfill something. And so as they're hurting in their budgets, especially right now with COVID, looking at how can we help incentivize recycling over disposal, but also creating sustainable funding mechanisms is a really important piece of this. We'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but we do recognize the need to make sure that there are those sustainable funding mechanisms to fund infrastructure and education throughout the country, two things that have traditionally not seen as much investment as they need. And then lastly, the Recycling Partnership itself is a great example of a public-private partnership. And we really strongly believe in having everyone at the table to help level up the system. So we did want to innovate, look at innovative and growing these public-private partnership concepts as we are diving into the policy realm. So we go to the next slide. You'll see here the partners that we work with on the policy arm specifically. And again, it's a wide range of materials and folks across the value chain that are helping inform the development of our policy. And so Lily, I'm going to take it back over to you to talk about kind of how we got to this point with our policy proposal.
Absolutely. Thanks, Elizabeth. So we go ahead and advance to the next slide. Our Accelerating Recycling Report, the policy to unlock supply for a circular economy, was the product of an intense collaborative process with the funding partners of the Circular Economy Accelerator that spanned the better part of 18 months. The proposal was co-developed with input from a wide variety of stakeholders shown on the slide before, that represent many different stages of the recycling process. We had meetings every 3 to 4 weeks for up to 5 or 6 hours at a time, which originally took place in person in DC, and then as with everything else got transferred over to Zoom. Regardless, these meetings were filled with tough conversations and a robust analysis of the many different policy options available. So all this to say, our public-private partnership approach was not easy, but it was worth it, because at the end of the process, we weren't left with just big ideas or talking points, but rather with an actionable path forward to making measurable change. And to understand where we ended up with our proposal, I think it's important that we understand where we started from. Really just the state of the US recycling system. So if you'll advance to the next slide. At the most basic level, we can ask ourselves, why do we care about recycling in the first place? Well, first off, recycling means jobs. And if you've attended enough sustainability events in and around the Chapel Hill area, you might have actually gotten a pen that says just that. But this is something that's known across the country. The most recent report from the EPA finds that recycling activities account for roughly 681,000 jobs in the United States, generating more than $37.8 billion in wages. That's an average of more than 10 times the number of jobs that are created by throwing things away. Secondly, recycling is not just an action that you do when you're done reading a magazine or after you've finished a can of soup. Recycling provides critical feedstock for the US supply chain, which is something that has been made clearer than ever by COVID-19. Paper mills, plastics reclaimers, aluminum and steel mills, glass plants, they all rely on the material delivered through the US recycling system to make new goods and keep those American jobs intact. A fun fact, recyclers are responsible for supplying more than half of the feedstock used by tissue mills to make toilet paper, which as 2020 taught us is just one of the most highly coveted products you can have on a shelf. And third, recycling protects the environment and the people in it. Because when you recycle, you displace the need to extract further virgin resources from our environment. This saves resources, and again, it creates jobs along the way. So next slide, please. Because of these benefits, people want to recycle, and companies want their products to be recycled. A recent survey found that while 83% of Americans view recycling as a valuable public service, only 59% have the same level of access to recycling services as they do for trash. And on the next slide, we see that this results in a national recycling system that consistently recovers less than 32% of available household recyclables. So to flip the numbers around a little bit, 68% of the material that is available through the US curbside recycling system is lost every single year. And when that material is lost, the job creation, the domestic manufacturing feedstock, the potential environmental benefits of recovering that material are all lost too. On the next slide, if we could turn that story around and capture the remaining 20 million tons of recyclables that are lost to disposal every year, by investing in infrastructure and behavior change, we could support 370,000 jobs in the United States alone. And this brings us back to the companies that you saw on our earlier slides. Next slide, please. The big brands and retailers that we showed that represent some of the 450 of the world's largest companies that have made global commitments to increase the recyclability and the use of recycled content in their products more than fivefold in the next several years. So this is amazing news, but the only issue is that with a recycling system that's capturing only 32% of what's out there, these commitments cannot be met, and our economy remains far from being circular. So if you'll advance to the next slide, you'll see some pictures that my colleague at the Recycling Partnership took while walking around his local grocery store. And if you're a curbside and recycling enthusiast, going to a grocery store is almost like going to a museum. It's pretty easy to geek out when you start to notice all the different kinds of packaging and all of the messages about recycling that are on those packages and products, including the ones pictured here. So every single one of these products pictured has a statement about recycling on it, whether it says that the package is recyclable or how the package can be recycled or that the package was made with recycled content. And on the next slide, we see some packaging formats and products that have even based the bulk of their sales pitch on the shelf around having recycled content in them. And this goes to show how important recycling really is to the average American consumer. And yet, despite this enthusiasm around recycling, the reality is that our economy is far from circular, and we have a recycling system that is inadequate to deliver on all of the promises being made on these packages. This is especially the case for plastics. And the reason that we have such a highly inefficient recycling system is largely due to our current funding structure. Next slide, please. In the United States today, local governments, and thus their taxpaying constituents, assume nearly full responsibility for residential recycling operations, collection, and education. This is to the tune of at least $4 billion in annual costs. This leaves approximately 20,000 different local governments across the country facing difficult decisions regarding what to recycle, how to recycle, or whether to offer recycling services at all, which results in enormous inconsistencies and inefficiencies across the country. So back when traveling was a thing that really happened, I can't even count the number of times that I was visiting family or friends in another state or even just another county in North Carolina where recycling looks entirely different or maybe was just even non-existent. And that's a result of having the fragmented system that we do today. So next slide. Having done our research, the message was clear. For the US to begin moving towards a circular economy, our residential recycling system needs to be leveled up. And on the next slide, we know that leveling up an entire system isn't easy, especially when that recycling system is not made up of just one thing or one action or one industry. It's a system of highly interdependent and loosely connected industries, players, and parts, all pictured here. And so as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, that's why we built the Circular Economy Accelerator, to develop public-private partnership solutions that address system change through policy. And to dive into the details of our solution, I will hand it over to you, Elizabeth.
Great. So as Lily mentioned, the very extensive process that we went through to develop this proposal, we're excited to share with you the contents of it. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Actually, one more from that. In our policy report, we highlight, 3 areas of the U.S. recycling system that need sustainable investment. So that's infrastructure, meaning carts and trucks and containers for multifamily recycling, and making sure that the sortation and processing infrastructure throughout the country is equipped to handle not only today's packaging types, but also tomorrow's packaging types. You saw from Lily the slide showing the many different types of packaging that are on today's shelves. And a lot of them are largely not able to be handled by today's material recovery facilities or MRFs. Education is another really important pillar here because we have to focus on improving quality in addition to quantity. After all these materials are becoming feedstock for manufacturing, and the higher the quality, the better the result for its ensuing product. And then our third pillar is support for local government programs. You saw on a previous slide how our recycling system is loosely connected and highly interdependent. And local governments are a really key part of the recycling system as they are responsible for collection in most parts of the country, and ensuring that they have the resources that they need to continue their important role is really critical. And then all of this needs to be supported by data and measurement to ensure that we know the best places to apply that intervention and ensure that the interventions are working. So we all know the old adage, what gets measured gets done, and we're firm believers of that at the Recycling Partnership. So if we go to the next slide, I'll cover that. Our policy proposal addresses these three needs through a shared responsibility model that includes a packaging and printed paper fee, as well as a federal disposal surcharge. And so this is a really data-driven model. What we're proposing is beginning with a needs assessment that will be conducted to decide what level the fees need to be in order to provide parity of access between trash and recycling. So for example, if you have curbside trash pickup, we want you to also have an equal option curbside recycling. The fees also going to cover what's needed in order to ensure high quality materials, meaning, a focus on education. So that's both traditional education means, such as stickers on carts and flyers and social media campaigns, but also cart tagging, which is where you give citizens feedback on the recycling. So what happens with cart tagging is that some folks walk ahead of the truck, they glance in folks' recycling carts to see if there's something in there that doesn't belong. So for example, let's say someone has bagged their recyclables, which is problematic for the facilities that process recyclable materials. They'll leave an oops tag that's got a cute little girl on it saying, oops, you bagged your recyclables, please unbag them and we'll come back and recollect it. And that real-time feedback has been shown to reduce contamination levels by up to 40% in those cities that we've worked in. And lastly, the fee is going to cover what's needed to help material recovery facilities, which are the places that our recycling goes for processing and kind of sorting into the different types of materials to be baled and then sold to another processor. That would help them incorporate the technology that's needed and the best practices that are needed in order to effectively and efficiently sort through materials once they arrive at a facility. And that's with the goal of being able to handle an increase in amount of packaging through the system, but also making sure that those bales on the other side are nice and clean. So the fee setting and the distribution of those fees would be handled through a brand-led third-party NGO with goals that are set in legislation. The fee is eco-modulated, which is my favorite word at the moment. And what that basically means is that it has financial incentives for environmental design criteria, which would include things like recycled content and design for recyclability. The other piece of this equation is a disposal surcharge. And we found that this is really a best practice. The revenue from this disposal surcharge would go to support community recycling operational cost, including folks who drive those trucks to collect materials, maintenance of these vehicles, but also helping offset those material recovery facility contracts, which have been a source of increased cost in recent years. And I'll mention, since this is a North Carolina audience, that North Carolina has a disposal surcharge in place currently that operates in a very similar way, at least for a portion of it. So we have a $2 tip fee in North Carolina, and $1 of that fee goes back to communities to help offset their operational cost. So if we go to the next slide, you saw this slide earlier, but that was a lot of information. So I thought it was good to kind of revisit this for a moment. The burden of today's funding the system really rests with local governments and taxpayers, which is why we've seen an underinvestment in infrastructure and other items, because their resources and ability to fund capital and investments are limited. There's a lot of competing demands on those local government dollars. So we go to the next slide. We'll look at how our model creates a shared responsibility system. So I'll point out that this is across material types because we need the whole system to be leveled up. I do want to note that the proposal that we're working on does not supersede things like bottle bills, which North Carolina does not have one, but other states, of course, do, or existing state disposal surcharges. But rather, put in place a system that has, the goal of this is put in place a system that has the infrastructure, the education, and the operational support that's needed to provide a better foundation for all other efforts to move towards a more circular economy. Recycling alone is not the circular economy, but we know that we can't achieve a truly circular economy without a robust recycling system. So again, you can see here the packaging and printed paper fee funds the consistent education and infrastructure in both access and sortation, while the disposal surcharge would be given back to states and local governments on a what we're envisioning a per capita basis to help offset those operational costs. Local governments would still maintain the responsibility of a good bit of the operational cost, but the burden that they have in the system is much lighter, creating a shared responsibility where the folks that put packaging on shelves and ultimately into our homes share the cost of the system with local governments. So if we go to the, let's see, I think the next slide, we showed you a slide earlier with the folks who were around the table over the past 18 months as we developed this concept. And these 18 companies and organizations are the endorsers of the policy report and this policy model. The folks that said, as we were putting pens down on that extensive process to develop this particular model, that we want this model to be considered by policymakers as we're looking towards how to level up the recycling system and move towards that more circular economy. And so we are pursuing this model, just so everyone knows, both in a few states, not in North Carolina, unfortunately, right now, but some other states, as well as at the federal level. So instead of me trying to represent the perspective of those who are endorsing this report, which is notable to get folks who traditionally have not been aligned on these issues together and rowing in the same direction. Our next slide has a couple of quotes so you can see kind of what's been motivating them. And again, a lot of them, for example, with Nestle, they've made a goal of 100% of their packaging being recyclable or reusable by 2025. That goal is not very far away in terms of years. We're very close to that. And then with Unilever as well, they've made a lot of really significant goals and are looking at ways to achieve those as well. So with that, we'll move on to questions. That was a lot of information. So we can, we don't have any questions yet, but Lily, any thoughts of anything you want to add?
I would just really emphasize that this, public-private partnership approach took a lot of work, and it was really exciting to get those supporters around the table. And it really means a lot for the circular economy and for protecting the environment and advancing the economy. So any questions that you all have about the process or about the proposal that we ended up with, we're happy to take any questions that you have.
Great. So we have a question about what the feedback we're getting from the partner groups and what are the next steps for the upcoming year. And so, the feedback we're getting is that, you saw the 18 folks on the slide are folks who are saying, yes, we're ready, we want to go forward. And there's folks on the spectrum. There are a lot of different proposals out there right now. And I think it really speaks to how much recycling and the circular economy is on the minds of lawmakers, both in state legislatures throughout the country and in the halls of Congress, that we're seeing a lot of different options out there. We're hearing a lot of support for the shared model, because it's one that definitely has producers participating in providing a steady stream of dollars towards some really needed infrastructure and education in the country. There are also some proposals out there for something called extended producer responsibility, which would be where producers fund the entire system. So that's another model that's out there. There are also proposals in Congress. There's one called the Recycle Act, which would fund education using federal taxpayer dollars to give an infusion of cash into recycling infrastructure, as well as some other proposals on including recycling and infrastructure packages. So a lot of varied approaches out there. Probably no one silver bullet. I think at the end of the day, we probably need a combination of these proposals moving forward.
And I'll add in, Elizabeth, with COVID-19, we saw a lot of disruptions to state legislatures and the federal electorate as a whole. And so, of course, there have been a lot of competing priorities for lawmakers' attention, but without COVID, we would have highly expected to see that some extended producer responsibility legislation passed in various states in the United States last year. And so we're seeing that same kind of legislation proposed again. So a lot of activity on our radar, and we're constantly monitoring, but it's a little bit like looking into a crystal ball. So we're never quite sure where policy is going to go.
And then another thing to point out too is, speaking of COVID-19 and local government budgets, Pennsylvania is a state recently that actually canceled all of their statewide recycling grants this year to the tune of, Lily, I think it was $50 million that is not going to local governments in the state of Pennsylvania. So we're also starting to monitor some of the pressures and stressors that local governments throughout the country are feeling with their recycling programs, which is also putting pressure on additional policy measures to help support the system. So we have another question about what we can learn from other states, what North Carolina can learn from other states that we're working with. And I'll start and then Lily, hand it to you. I will say North Carolina's recycling program, and I would say this even if Lily and I did not live in North Carolina, is really top notch. We've got some fantastic recycling division staff within the Department of Environmental Quality who have done, just for example, in the past year, an amazing education campaign where they actually mapped out the different material recovery, what you call MRF sheds, which is a funny way of saying basically the service area that a material recovery facility operates within and pulls from. And so why that's important is what a local government can accept in its program is dependent upon what the material recovery facility that they contract with can accept and can process in their facility. So there are 18 MRF sheds in North Carolina, and the Wendy Worley, who's the head of recycling for North Carolina's program, and her team did a great job of mapping those out, figuring out what materials they accepted, and then did customized education campaigns for each of those areas, in addition to all the other great things that they do. So I would say a lot of states actually look to North Carolina for best practices. Lily, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one thing that comes to the top of mind of what we've learned when working in other states, sort of as a lesson learned the hard way, is that North Carolina is really great about data collection. Elizabeth was mentioning the example of the MRF shed work that we've done, but a lot of states are not. And so what we find is that the lack of data across the nation is really inconsistent, kind of matching with those same inconsistencies and inefficiencies that we see with these localized programs. So working in other states, we really see the need for a collaborative response, one that we can understand the data at the very most basic level. It's the pillar of our policy. Understand the data of what recycling even looks like in other states, and we can compare apples to apples instead of having really great data in North Carolina and almost nothing in other parts of the country.
Great. We have another question asking about how the analytics part of our proposal will hopefully help drive the use of alternate materials away from single-use containers and non-recyclable and non-reusable materials going into landfill. So I'll break that into kind of two parts. One is that our proposal certainly is incentivizing from an economic perspective the use of more recyclable materials in packaging, because the way that the eco-modulation portion of the fee is set up, so when it's determined how much a brand would pay into the system if they've got recyclable packaging or incorporating recyclable materials or other kind of that environmental design criteria present, then they get a discount. And so there is that's helping match up some of the economic aspects of packaging. If you think about within a big company, sometimes the folks making the packaging decisions are not necessarily talking with the sustainability folks. And so that's an effort to really marry up those two decision-making streams so that we're able to get a better, kind of recyclable packaging out there. But you also make a really good point about the need to drive more reusables and refillable containers and just reducing waste overall. And, recycling system, the circular economy is not, recycling is not the circular economy, but the circular economy can't exist without recycling being that kind of last line of defense before it hits a landfill. So I'd say that this is, there's a lot more that needs to be done. This is one piece of that. I know that with having a stronger infrastructure in place and a lot of attention being paid to these issues, we're starting to hear from our partners that they're really exploring some of these areas in depth as well. And we're seeing some of those initial pilots kind of coming out. Lily, anything you would add?
Just one minor expansion of what Elizabeth touched upon is, having that packaging fee inherently incentivizes not only through the eco-modulation, the adoption of that environmental design criteria, but also the fact that they're paying a fee on the amount of packaging that they produce is an incentive to think about, what packaging is necessary and where it can be reduced. So that there just isn't as much packaging in general. So I would just add that point, but Elizabeth, you covered it well.
And then there's another question about, have companies gotten past this idea of increased cost for the initial recycling models? And I think what's notable that we're seeing today is that they are getting past that. A lot of companies are very willing to be a contributing partner in that system. So that's, I'd say, there's been a marked shift even in the past year or two in corporate attitudes on this issue. And we're definitely seeing that with our partners, but also seeing it kind of across the landscape. And then there's also a message about, or a question about what messages have resonated with local governments or with state governments. Lily, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question correctly, but pull me back if I don't. The messages that we really see resonating are sort of just those key benefits that we talked about earlier, about that recycling creates jobs, recycling protects the planet and the people that live in it. And that recycling does not just stop at the bin, it really serves that purpose of providing domestic critical supply to US manufacturers. And so we see that when the bigger picture, when all of the benefits of recycling are recognized, states really benefit from that, and citizens want to see that, they want to recycle. So these kinds of messages are what we see being impactful in terms of understanding the importance of recycling and the benefits that it brings. And in terms of messages for recycling education, educating citizens on how to recycle and how to recycle well. Really simple, clean, consistent messages do the trick. We don't want citizens to be overwhelmed. We want them to be empowered, to know that they're making a difference in their economy and their environment by participating in their recycling system, and to make it easy for them to understand what to do, because nobody needs more confusion in their life added at the curb of their street. So,
yeah. And there's been some, because this is kind of getting to another question that came in about, reminding people how to recycle. Our colleagues at the partnership have done a lot of research into how to most effectively get across those messages. And they've got it down to a science about how many messages, how many seconds it should take to read it. And we've actually developed, I say the we kind of broadly, Lily's and my colleagues at the partnership have developed some great toolkits for communities that are free resources where they can go in, upload their logo and which items they accept, and it actually creates materials free of charge for them to use in communicating with their citizens and their residents, and social media campaigns that they can use, and a lot of other great tools, posters and flyers, etc., that can help them make that clear educational message. And we've got a question about talking about our personal journey from UNC to our current career. So Lily, this is fairly recent for you. I would love for you to share kind of your journey from being on the other side, as you mentioned earlier, of these presentations to where you are now and presenting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got to know the recycling partnership as a student by actually participating in a course taught at the UNC School of Government. And so it was a really exciting way to learn more about how the public and private sectors are engaged to improve the recycling system, which, really dives into the economy, the environment, so many different facets of what I was really interested in learning, both in my education with public policy and environmental studies as the degrees that I was pursuing. And from being involved as a Leaders in Environment and Finance Fellow through the School of Government and the Environmental Finance Center. I was able to work with the Recycling Partnership, and luckily enough, they decided to keep me around, which was great, much appreciated. And really, I pull from the skills that I learned in my degree. Just about every single day of my job, I'm really thinking about critical policy solutions and the environmental themes and principles that I was taught. So it's not been a very long and winding road for sure, since from UNC to my current career, but it's been a really great one. Elizabeth, I'll hand it over to you.
Mine's were long and meandering. I graduated from UNC quite a few years before Lily, but definitely actually left and got into the environmental field, where I was an advocate on a variety of environmental issues, including at the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources as their legislative director. During the passage of the 2007 Solid Waste Management Act. And that was where, I really was working on things like electronics recycling and the disposal surcharge I referenced earlier, and basically rewriting our, participating in the process and working with the legislature and rewriting our landfill laws. So that was kind of the early part of my career, kind of UNC leading there. And then I went back to get my Master of Public Administration through the UNC School of Government's online MPA program, which is a great program that you should check out. It enables folks like me who are working full time and have a family to be able to go back and still get my master's degree, which was a great experience. It's a really great program. And through that, I actually did my thesis capstone project on state level regulation of food waste, which is what reconnected me with some former colleagues who were at the partnership and led to me eventually coming back there. So it's a longer winding path, but that's how UNC has woven in there. We've had another question come in about if the MRF data, let's see, looks like that was, Lily, you got it covered, great. Looking at the MRF data and the MERSHA maps, I'll look and see if, I don't know, Lily, if that's available externally or not. I know I've heard Wendy Worley give presentations on it. If we can find that, we'll be sure to follow up with the folks putting on the webinar, and we'll provide that. Let's see. Got a question about how the partner companies participate on the policy side, if they sign letters or how they show support. And so you'll, with a slide, actually we can flip back a few slides if you don't mind, Brenda, and look at, so these are the endorsers of our policy report, and they lent their logos for us to use as part of the report and also as part of some of the materials. They also participate in meetings to signal their support with certain lawmakers. And, they all have their own advocacy shops. And so they are working in support of policies being adopted that are consistent with our policy report. Lily, anything you would add to that?
No, I just think, well, I guess one thing is that, being a supporter is both having their name on the page, but also really investing in the resources and the political advocacy that it takes to pass this legislation. Because like I said, this isn't just a big idea that we want to talk about. This is something that we really want to see implemented in practice. And we're excited to be on that process of doing so right now.
That's right. We had another, this actually leads nicely into another question we had about, the process of forming public-private partnerships. And it's a challenging process. The partnership itself is a public-private partnership, and actually was started as a result of an EPA grant that, led to a process that led to its establishment because there was no action agent that was, tying or bridging the gap between these companies and trying to meet their sustainability goals and on the ground action in communities. And so, I think having, when you're developing public-private partnerships, having a trusted partner who can help facilitate those conversations and help bring folks to the table in a way where different voices are heard, and you also can bring expertise to the conversation, I think is a good lesson learned from how the partnership has operated. And it's not an easy process. We have regular meetings. Luckily now over Zoom, they're not 5 hours anymore. We try to keep them a little shorter. But at the end of last year, we polled our folks and said, how are you feeling about this past year? And kind of did a fun survey. And it's interesting to kind of hear their perspectives. And it ranges from, exciting and motivating to it's also frustrating. And I think we identify with that too. Going through a process with this many folks, we actually kept outgrowing rooms when we were developing this policy proposal, and got to the point that we would have, now it's regularly 60, 70, sometimes more folks, actively participating in conversations around what needs to happen. And people are going to come at that with different perspectives and different goals. Hopefully all the ultimate end goal of driving towards a more circular economy, but it's a matter of hearing folks out and still keeping that mission kind of front of mind. And I'd say another best practice as you're building public-private partnerships is we have ground rules for our coalition, and we remind folks of those at the beginning of every meeting. And it's how we're going to work together. And it's everything from not attributing comments to folks outside of the meeting so we can have an open and honest dialogue, to disclosing conflicts of interest, or if you're going to work against something, stepping away. So it's that's definitely been a best practice from working there. We've also, though, in terms of working with communities, Lily, do you want to talk about the PSAG process? Or sorry, I shouldn't use the acronym. The Public Sector Advisory Group process, and how we've also been working to bring communities to the table.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've been, as Elizabeth, we've been calling it PSAG, terrible acronym, but for the Public Sector Advisory Group, we've been convening a number of different community partners of ours from all across the nation. I think we've got upwards of 30 different cities and counties and municipalities involved to get their perspectives and their understanding of how this policy would work for them, and to get their input and feedback on how we can further develop and improve this policy, because we know that it's important to have every single sector of the recycling chain that we showed the system really spans across all of the industry. It spans across private and public partners. So getting their feedback has been a really informative process and really helpful. It raises critical questions that, it's a perspective that we can't bring simply as being a convener, but that we can listen to and that we can understand and bring back to our industry partners as well, so that we can continue to have this conversation and collaboration across the different sectors. And one component that I'll add to Elizabeth's response about public-private partnerships is that it's truly amazing to have these, large multinational corporations sitting in a room that are competitors out on the shelves, but that can come together over they still have a lot of different perspectives, but a shared desire and need to improve the recycling system that is for all of the companies, regardless of their competitive stances. So really just amazing to see this process. And like Elizabeth said, it's not easy, but it's definitely worthwhile. And it's something that we could see replicated in any number of different policy areas.
Great. And I'll let the person who asked the question earlier know that I just posted the information for the NC Merched map. There's some great information on that website. So it looks like we're coming towards the close of the questions. Lily, are you seeing any that I've missed? Let's see.
No, not on my end.
Great. And we really appreciate you all having us today. Kirsten, may I hand it back over to you?
Yes, thank you so much. And I think it's, we've heard a couple things today, of course. Recycling is jobs. Recycling is supply chain resources. And recycling is environmental impact across communities across North Carolina, and of course, other places as well. So on behalf of the IE Cleantech Corner, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Lily, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being on the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing in the next couple of days. So thank you so much. Take care, everyone.